I had bought the flowers myself. That should have been my first sign, but I was too excited to notice. Valentine's Day was our anniversary too, which made it double the reason to celebrate. I had closed the office early, driven to the restaurant, and walked in holding red roses I planned to leave beside his plate as a surprise. The hostess smiled when I gave my name. "Your table is ready," she said. "The other party already arrived." I thought, he beat me here. I turned the corner past the host stand and saw the back of his dark jacket. I almost called his name. Then I saw her. She was sitting across from him at the corner table, the one reserved under our anniversary name, the one he always said was our spot. His hand covered hers on the white tablecloth. He leaned forward and kissed her. Everything around me went absolutely still. When I stepped closer, he looked up. He didn't panic. He didn't pull away. He just exhaled, the slow, tired sigh of someone caught doing something inconvenient. "I was going to tell you after the holiday," he said. "Then, you've been more business partner than fiancé anyway." The restaurant went quiet. I placed the ring on the table and walked out. The night air hit me before my emotions did. I sat in the driver's seat of my car in the parking lot, hands on the wheel, roses still in the passenger seat. My mind wasn't spinning the way I expected. It had gone somewhere very focused and very cold. My phone buzzed. A business banking notification. I stared at it for 3 full seconds before I understood what I was looking at. Kyle had attempted to authorize a large withdrawal from our company account. The timestamp showed it happened 11 minutes ago, while he was still sitting at that table. He had planned for tonight. He knew this dinner would end us. While I was driving there with flowers, he was preparing to take what he thought was his share. I sat with that for a long time. Then something crystallized, slowly and completely. He assumed he had equal financial control over the company. He had been present at meetings. He had watched me handle banking. He had seen numbers on screens. But he had never asked to be added to the account. He had never signed a single banking document. Because paperwork bored him. I put the car in drive and said it aloud to no one. "You picked the worst possible day to do this. My name is Nadia Vale." 3 years before that Valentine's night, I was working from a spare bedroom with a folding table, a second-hand laptop, and a business plan written by hand in a notebook because I couldn't afford design software. The company, a boutique product sourcing and wholesale distribution firm, grew because I refused to let it fail. I tracked every invoice, negotiated every supplier contract, and reinvested every early profit back into operations instead of drawing a salary for the first 8 months. I taught myself inventory systems, shipping logistics, and basic accounting because I couldn't yet afford to hire people who knew those things. Kyle came into my life during year 2. He was charming and motivated. When he lost his job 18 months into our relationship, I brought him into the business as operations manager. I covered his salary from company funds while he learned the systems. He was good with people. Clients liked him. He handled supplier meetings and team scheduling while I managed everything financial. I never cared about credit. I cared about the partnership. The business was doing well by the time he proposed. I remembered thinking, this is everything I worked for. The morning after Valentine's Day, I pulled out the original incorporation documents. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and read through every page the way I hadn't since we first filed them. My lawyer at the time, a calm, precise woman named Attorney Osei, had given me one piece of advice when we set up the business banking structure. "Until the company is stable and any partnerships are legally formalized," she said, "keep all financial authority centralized. One signatory. You." I had done exactly that. Kyle had been present for a few early legal conversations, but he always drifted to his phone when documents came out. Paperwork bored him, his words. So he had signed the operational partnership agreement giving him his management role, but he had never been added to the banking authority. He knew the business account number. He had seen me log in. He assumed presence meant access. It didn't. My phone buzzed. Another banking notification. He had tried again, a different transaction amount, as though changing the number would change the result. Access denied, the screen read. I set my phone face down and kept reading. Before that night shattered everything, our life had looked a certain way. Morning started with coffee at the kitchen counter while we both checked emails. He would talk through the day's schedule, supplier meetings, deliveries expected. I would review the financials and flag anything unusual. We moved around each other efficiently. Comfortable. Practiced. Wedding planning had its own folder on my laptop. We had chosen a venue, debated catering menus, and argued pleasantly about whether the ceremony needed a string quartet. He always wanted more, bigger venue, more guests, more visible celebration. I preferred smaller and meaningful. At industry events, he spoke confidently about the company. Clients responded warmly to him. He was easy to talk to, quick with names, good at managing the energy in a room. I was the one who stayed late preparing the proposals those conversations led to, but I never minded. I was proud of what we were building. I remembered a specific moment, a supplier dinner about 6 months before Valentine's Day. A colleague asked who handled company finances. Kyle said casually and confidently, "We both do." I had smiled and said nothing. Looking back, that silence was the truest summary of how our partnership had always worked. The warning signs had been there. I had simply chosen not to read them. About 8 months before Valentine's Day, I found an expense report that didn't match any invoice in our system. The amount was modest, small enough to overlook if you weren't tracking closely. I flagged it to Kyle and he said he must have miscoded a supplier meeting. I accepted that. 2 months later, a supplier called to confirm a payment we hadn't made. When I checked, the original transfer had been redirected. Kyle said it was a banking error. I followed up with the bank. They had no record of a system issue. I filed it under Investigate Further and got busy with a large client order. There were late supplier meetings absent from the shared calendar. Casual questions, framed offhandedly, about what would happen to company ownership if we ever separated. He once asked what percentage he would be entitled to if they brought in an external investor. I told him the ownership structure was formalized in the incorporation documents. He nodded and changed the subject. That night, I opened the company audit folder. 3 invoices from the previous quarter were simply gone. I didn't call Kyle. That was the first decision, and I made it without much deliberation. Calling him would have handed him information I wasn't ready to share. It would have told him I was looking, that I was building a picture, that his window to quietly arrange things was closing. Instead, I called our accountant, a methodical man named Mr. Abra, at 8 in the morning. I told him I needed a full transaction review for the past 12 months and that it was urgent. He asked if something had triggered the request. I said yes and told him I would explain more after the review was complete. He called back 4 hours later. His voice was careful, the tone of someone who has found something unexpected and is choosing words with deliberate precision. There are several transfers labeled as operational expenses, he said, that I cannot match to any vendor invoice, supplier contract, or purchase order in our records. He listed 7 of them. Different amounts, different dates, all routed to the same destination account, an account not connected to any registered supplier. I thanked him and asked him to compile everything into a document. Then I opened my laptop and began downloading every financial record the company held. By the time everything was downloaded and organized, the folder was larger than I expected. Mr. Abra had flagged the obvious entries. But when I cross-referenced those with the full transaction history going back 18 months, a pattern appeared that was clearer and more deliberate than I had hoped to find. The amounts were small individually. $50 here. $120 there. Occasionally a few hundred, labeled with operational codes that looked routine unless you pulled the corresponding invoice, which, in each case, didn't exist. Individually they looked like rounding errors. Together, they added up to a number that sat in my chest like a stone. He had been doing this since shortly after joining the company. Not frantically, methodically. Patient, slow, careful enough to stay beneath the threshold of obvious concern. The transfers led to a personal account registered in his name. I created a folder on my personal drive, separate from the business server. I labeled it Documentation. Inside I placed every flagged transaction, the corresponding missing invoice reference, and the bank statement page showing the receiving account. My phone buzzed. A message from Kyle. We should talk tomorrow about dividing things fairly. I think we can handle this without lawyers. I read it twice, closed my phone, and kept working. I met with attorney Ose the following morning. I brought the documentation folder on a USB drive and a printed summary Mr. Abra had prepared. She reviewed both while I sat across from her desk, reading without rushing. When she looked up, her expression was composed and precise. Walk me through his role in the banking structure, she said. I did. I explained his operational partnership agreement, his management responsibilities, and the fact that he had never been added as a banking signatory. She nodded slowly. He has no legal authority over company funds, she said. None. The unauthorized withdrawal attempts, twice, from what you've shown me, are not just failed transactions. Depending on how they're classified, they could constitute attempted financial fraud. She explained that the pattern of misdirected transfers, combined with missing invoices, met the threshold for documented financial misconduct within a business partnership. He thinks he's leaving this relationship with half the company, I said quietly. Attorney Ose folded her hands. Legally, based on what you've brought me today, he may be leaving with nothing, and possibly owing repayment. That afternoon, Kyle posted Valentine's Day photos online. Him and the woman from the restaurant, smiling. The caption read, "Starting a new chapter." My phone filled up within the hour. Friends, colleagues, people I hadn't spoken to in months, all sending screenshots with different versions of the same question, "Are you seeing this?" Some were gentle. Some were not. A few sent messages that were half concern and half the need to be the one who told me. I read every message. I didn't reply to any of them. Kyle had posted publicly because he expected a reaction. He expected tears, or confrontation, or a public emotional response that would frame whatever came next as my instability rather than his betrayal. He had written his narrative already. He was starting fresh. The implication was clear, he was choosing to leave. The relationship, the business, all of it had simply run its course. He assumed I was sitting somewhere falling apart. I was at my desk scheduling an internal business review meeting with Mr. Abra and our senior logistics coordinator. There were 2 major client orders processing that week. Quarterly reporting was due. A supplier contract renewal was pending that I had been meaning to finalize for 6 weeks. The business did not pause because my personal life had fractured. I sent the calendar invitations and turned my phone face down. Kyle walked into the office the next morning like he still owned it. There was a particular posture he carried when things felt like they were going his way, shoulders back, unhurried pace, the easy confidence of a man who believes the room is already prepared to receive him. I had seen it hundreds of times. I recognized it immediately. He poured coffee from the break room and came into the main area where I was reviewing quarterly figures with the logistics coordinator. He waited until she stepped out. Then he sat across from me and talked about restructuring. He used that word 3 times in the first 4 minutes, restructuring ownership, restructuring operational agreements, potentially bringing in a buyer for a partial share now that things were shifting. He spoke about it the way you speak about rearranging furniture. A neutral, practical matter 2 reasonable adults could decide over coffee. I listened. I took notes, not for his benefit, for mine. When he paused, I asked one question, calmly and without particular emphasis. Have you checked the account access lately? He blinked. What do you mean? Just checking, I said, and went back to my figures. He tried the banking portal from his laptop that afternoon. I knew because the system sent me a notification whenever a login attempt was made using a device not registered to the primary signatory account. His laptop had never been registered to anything. The notification appeared on my phone at 2:17 p.m., and I watched it quietly. I waited. At 2:34, he appeared in my office doorway. "There's something wrong with the system," he said. "I can't get into the accounts." I looked up from my screen. "Security protocols were updated recently," I said. "Access is now restricted to authorized signatories." He stared. "I can't access it at all?" "Only authorized signatories," I repeated, and returned to my work. He stood a moment, recalibrating, deciding whether this was a glitch or something deliberate. He hadn't arrived at the correct answer yet. That afternoon, he drove to a supplier to settle a small operational expense using the company card he carried for approved purchases. The card declined. I had placed a spending hold on all secondary cards that morning, requiring my approval for any transaction above $20. His call came through at 4:52 p.m. I let it ring. He came to find me in person. I was in the back office reviewing the documentation folder with Mr. Abra when Kyle knocked on the open door and stepped in without waiting. His easy confidence from the morning had contracted into something tighter. He said I was being emotional. He used that word deliberately, the way people do when they want to reframe a strategic response as an irrational one. He said freezing accounts and restricting cards was petty and that it wouldn't help anyone. He said a lawyer would sort everything in his favor because ownership was ownership and he had given years to the company. I let him finish. Mr. Abra sat beside me, quiet and professional. "Are you done?" I asked. "I'm just saying lawyers will fix this." "Mine already has," I said. "She filed protective financial controls 2 days ago. Everything you've attempted to access or transfer since Valentine's Day is part of an active documentation review." He went still. "What does that mean?" "It means everything is documented," I said. "You should speak to your own attorney." He left the office. 20 minutes later, an official compliance notification email arrived in his inbox from the banking institution. The system copied me automatically. The account freeze went through on a Thursday morning. Attorney Osei had filed for a formal financial protection review on company accounts, citing documented evidence of attempted unauthorized transactions and patterns of misdirected transfers. The bank's compliance department placed a temporary hold on any outgoing transactions that didn't carry my verified authorization. Kyle's 2 attempted withdrawals from Valentine's night were now part of that review file. Transaction records, timestamps, device information from each attempt, all of it sitting in a compliance folder at the bank, alongside everything Mr. Abra had documented. His attempts to move money hadn't just failed. They had become evidence. The shift across the office that week was subtle but visible. The casual authority Kyle had always carried began to loosen at the edges. Suppliers who expected quick operational approvals were now routed through my office directly. Payroll authorization required my signature only, and everyone who processed payroll knew it. He came into my office Thursday afternoon and asked when the accounts would be unfrozen. I told him I didn't have a timeline and suggested he follow up with the bank's compliance department. He stood at my door a moment longer than felt comfortable, then left. The employees noticed the change before the week was over. They were perceptive people, most of them had been with us long enough to read the undercurrents of how a small company functions. When the person who approved expenses suddenly can't approve his own coffee, when supplier calls that used to route through operations now go straight to the owner's line, people pay attention. And they talk. I didn't address it formally. I ran the Monday morning operations meeting the same way I always had, answered questions directly, made decisions quickly, kept things moving without drama. 2 clients called that week to say they appreciated how smoothly their orders were being handled. One mentioned specifically that communication had been clearer lately. Kyle's operational presence within the company was shrinking because his approvals were no longer being processed. Then a vendor called my office, confused. She had received a payment meant for her company, but it had come from an account she didn't recognize. She was asking for clarification before accepting. The account she referenced was the personal account from our documentation folder. I thanked her, told her not to accept the transfer, and added the call to our records. Mr. Abra submitted his formal findings the following week. The report was 23 pages. It documented every flagged transaction, traced each to the receiving personal account, noted the absence of corresponding invoices, and calculated the cumulative total with supporting bank statement references. His language was professional and precise. There was no ambiguity. Kyle requested a private meeting with me 2 days after the report was finalized. He arrived looking different from any version of himself I had seen before, not the confident man from the morning after Valentine's Day, not the pressured version from the week of the account freeze. He was quiet. Careful. He said he was confused about how certain operational transfers had been processed. He used the word confused 3 times. He said things had gotten complicated and he wanted to handle it reasonably and quickly. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then, everything is documented, Kyle. Every transaction, every date, every receiving account. My accountant's report is already with my attorney. He looked at the table between us. What does that mean for me? He asked. Legal mediation has been scheduled, I said. You'll receive the formal notice by end of week. The social fallout arrived the way it always does, gradually, then suddenly. For the first week after Valentine's Day, the public version of the story was the one Kyle had written. His post, his caption, his new beginning. Friends who didn't know the full picture offered polite congratulations. Mutual contacts expressed sympathy toward me with the careful tone of people who assume there must be 2 sides. Then the picture started to emerge. Kyle's close friends, the ones who had attended our company launch, who had been at our engagement dinner, started making calls once the rumor of financial misconduct became harder to contain. Conversations shifted when the compliance review and legal mediation notices became known. The woman from the restaurant apparently distanced herself once she understood the financial investigation attached to his name. Whatever story he had told her about his situation, the legal reality didn't match it. On a Thursday evening, Kyle appeared at my apartment door without calling ahead. He stood on the doorstep looking like someone who had run the numbers and finally arrived at an outcome he hadn't prepared for. I just want to talk, he said. Without lawyers. Then you should have thought about that on Valentine's Day, I told him. Good night, Kyle. He tried one more time, properly, through his own attorney. He requested a meeting framed as preliminary mediation. Attorney Osei and I attended. He arrived with a folder of talking points, sat across from me for the first time since Valentine's night with something other than confidence in his posture. He talked about stress. Fear of commitment. Feeling invisible in the business, like a supporting actor in something I had written alone. He said he had made terrible decisions out of insecurity and understood what they had cost. His attorney sat beside him, silent. I listened carefully to all of it. And I noticed something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel heartbroken anymore. The grief I had anticipated, complicated and heavy, had quietly been replaced by something else entirely. Clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally stop hoping the picture will look different from what it actually is. What he had done to the business was documented. What he had done to me personally was separate, mine to process privately, in my own time. In that moment, they were 2 completely different things. Attorney Osei slid a formal ownership clarification notice across the table. The legal mediation confirmed what Attorney Osei had outlined from the very beginning of our first meeting. The session lasted most of a morning. Both attorneys were present. A neutral mediator reviewed the full documentation package, Mr. Abra's findings, the bank compliance report, the transaction trail, missing invoice records, and both attempted unauthorized withdrawals from Valentine's night. The mediator was measured and thorough. The operational partnership agreement Kyle had signed when he joined gave him a management role and a defined salary structure. It did not grant him equity ownership. It did not grant him financial signing authority. It did not entitle him to a share of assets upon separation. He had spent years believing that presence was the same as ownership. That simply being in the room was the same as being named on the paperwork. It wasn't. The ruling confirmed I retained full financial control. The misdirected transfers were classified as misappropriated business funds. A repayment obligation would be formalized in settlement terms. Kyle's operational role was terminated, effective immediately. He sat very still when the terms were read aloud. For all his talk of lawyers fixing everything, the lawyers had, entirely in my direction. The company didn't slow down. I had half expected an adjustment period after the structural change. It didn't come. Client orders processed, supplier relationships held steady. Once Kyle's approvals were no longer creating confusion in the workflow, things moved more smoothly than they had in over a year. I hired a new operations manager, a woman named Petra who came recommended by a long-standing supplier contact. She was organized, direct, and asked excellent questions during her first week. By week 3, she had already identified 2 inefficiencies in the scheduling system and proposed fixes for both. 2 clients, when they learned about the management change, specifically reached out to say they appreciated the consistency of my communication throughout the process. Revenue for the month was the strongest we had seen in 18 months. Mr. Abra sent me the figures with a brief note, "Good quarter." I sat with that for a moment. For so long, so much of my energy had gone toward managing the emotional complexity of the business alongside the personal one. Without that weight, I had more focus than I knew what to do with. Then an email arrived. An industry publication was nominating the company for an Emerging Business Leadership Award under my name. The industry event was held in late spring. An annual recognition evening for businesses in our sector, organized by the Regional Trade Association. I had been nominated for Emerging Business Leadership, which still felt slightly surreal on the invitation. Petra came with me. We arrived early, found our table, and I spent the first hour in genuine conversation with clients and colleagues I respected. 2 senior business owners told me they had voted for our company and carefully explained why with specific, considered reasons. I realized somewhere in the middle of the second hour that the people in that room had always seen my contribution clearly. It was only in my own internal accounting that I had consistently undervalued it. Then, during a networking break, I saw Kyle. He was standing near the far edge of the room, holding a glass he wasn't drinking from. He looked thinner. His posture had lost the particular ease he always carried in rooms like this, the comfort of a man who believed every space was already prepared for him. He saw me at the very same moment I saw him. Neither of us moved for a second. Then he walked over. He reached me just as the room's ambient noise created enough cover for a brief, private exchange. He looked like someone who had been having a long internal argument and arrived at a conclusion he'd accepted without being happy about it. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," I said. He glanced at the award program on the table behind me and nodded, a small, genuine acknowledgement. "Congratulations," he said. "On the nomination. You built something real." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in months. Possibly longer. I thanked him and told him I hoped things were going well for him. He said something vague about figuring out next steps. Nothing performative. No angle. Just a man at the edge of a room where he no longer had a clear role. I shook his hand and turned back to my table. Walking away first had never felt so uncomplicated. That evening, before the award ceremony concluded, I received an email from a business development firm that had been tracking our company's recent performance. They were interested in discussing an acquisition conversation when I had time. I saved the email and allowed myself a quiet smile on the drive home. I took the acquisition meeting out of curiosity more than urgency. The firm sent 2 representatives, well prepared, clearly having done their research. They had tracked our revenue trajectory, noted our client base stability, and proposed a partial acquisition structure that would bring investment capital while leaving me in a controlling operational role. I listened carefully, asked questions, and thanked them for their time. After they left, I sat in the office alone for a while, the same office where I had worked late into hundreds of evenings refining supplier contracts and client proposals while Kyle handled the parts of the business that involved being seen. I wasn't ready to sell any portion of it. Not yet. What I was ready for was growth on my own terms. I brought Petra into a planning session the following week. We spent 2 hours mapping an expansion model, a second operational hub, 3 new supplier partnerships, a more structured client onboarding process. The energy in that room was different from anything I had felt in years. Focused. Clean. No undercurrent of tension to navigate around. One quiet evening, I opened my old message folder and scrolled back to the Valentine's banking notification. Withdrawal attempt, $47,200. Status, declined. I stared at it for a moment. Then deleted it. Updates about Kyle arrived the way unwanted news always does, not from sources I sought out, but through the natural movement of information in shared networks. His finances were strained. The repayment obligation from the mediation settlement was formal and enforceable. He had moved out of the apartment he had been renting and returned to a situation that, from what I understood, involved relying on family support. Professional reputation damage within our industry was harder to recover from than he had apparently anticipated. Mutual suppliers and contacts had long memories. The relationship with the woman from Valentine's night had ended. I heard that through a mutual friend who mentioned it without particular emphasis, the way people relay information they don't consider significant. I received it the same way. None of it produced satisfaction, exactly. What I felt was closer to recognition, confirmation that actions had consequences, that the system worked the way it was supposed to, that I hadn't needed to engineer any of his outcomes because the documentation had already done that work. I thought about what he had said at the restaurant. You've been more business partner than fiancé anyway. As the second Valentine's Day approached, I realized he had just described someone who built something that outlasted him completely. I closed the office early on Valentine's Day. Not because the date still hurt, it didn't, not the way I had expected. I closed early because the team had worked hard through a strong quarter and deserved the evening. Petra suggested it and I agreed immediately. I drove home through the city with the windows down despite the chill, thinking about the year behind me. 12 months earlier, I had walked into a restaurant with flowers and walked out with a ring left on a white tablecloth. By the time I reached my car, the man I thought I was building a future with had already tried to take what he believed was his share. He called me more business partner than fiancé, as though being prepared and competent was something to be ashamed of. As though building something solid made me less worthy of love. He forgot that the same discipline that built the business protected it when he tried to take it. I was the sole signatory. I had always been the sole signatory. Not because I planned the betrayal. Because I had simply been careful from the beginning. He thought love made me weak. He forgot I had built everything strong enough to survive without him. Preparation doesn't panic. Quiet strength always outlasts betrayal.